Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing the Relative Strength Index, or RSI. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, we've talked about the RSI a few times in the past. And just to remind you, it's not really the best indicator to use by itself. And one of the reasons for that is things can stay overbought or oversold for really long periods of time. Furthermore, just because the RSI is putting in lower highs doesn't mean that the asset in question is actually putting in lower highs. And that's what a lot of people would call, a divergence, maybe a bearish divergence. For instance, imagine if you thought Bitcoin dominance, we worked it in early, right? All these videos we do are Bitcoin dominance videos. I just put a different title to make everyone think that it's about something else, but it's really always about the same thing. Imagine if in October of 2023, you thought the top for Bitcoin dominance was in because you saw the weekly RSI was at 77. And you might have looked and said, all right, well, the last time the weekly RSI hit 77, it was more or less around the top for dominance, right? There were a lot of people back then that were very confident that Bitcoin dominance was topping out because they saw the weekly RSI at a pretty high level. They ignored monetary policy and they called for alt season because they saw the weekly RSI hit the same level it kind of topped out in the cycle before. Now, they would have been right that the weekly RSI would have been putting in more than likely the cycle high. That would have corresponded to Bitcoin dominance at around 54%. But despite the fact that the weekly RSI topped way back then in 2023, Bitcoin dominance went up a lot more, right? Went from 54% to 66%. And so you can see that the weekly RSI is putting in lower highs, but it hasn't stopped Bitcoin dominance from ultimately going higher. So we have to remember that, right? You cannot look at a metric like the relative strength index and arbitrarily use it to say, what might or might not be able to happen for the asset. So when you look at Bitcoin USD and you look at the weekly RSI, you'll notice that the high for this cycle that very well might be the high in terms of the weekly RSI was at 88, and it occurred back in March of 2024. So if you would use that as the signal for the top, well, you can see there were two rallies after that that led to even higher highs in the Bitcoin price, even though the strength of the rally was dropping. And so a lot of people are trying to figure out, where is this cycle going? Now, there's a lot of people that say that next year will be a continuation of the bull market, right? Because the argument is that if you don't have a euphoria phase in the post-halving year, then why can't you get one next year? Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like the chart is necessarily supporting that idea. There does exist a scenario where Bitcoin could get another rally, but I don't think it's going to lead to new highs in the midterm year. If we get a new high, I think it'll lead to it in the post-halving year, right? So sometime over the next 7 weeks or so. You can already see that the weekly RSI for Bitcoin is putting in lower highs, right? So we're kind of setting ourselves up for the weakness in the midterm year. You can see that higher highs in the price corresponded to lower highs in the weekly RSI. So every rally has gotten a little bit less impressive than the last one. Now, in order to really be confident about the cycle being over in the fourth quarter, and again, I do think the top is in the fourth quarter of the year, the only question is it October or not? And it very well could be, but what happened in 2017, in order to confirm that the top was in, was this trend line, or sorry, not trend line, this horizontal support level on the weekly RSI eventually broke. And when it broke, it meant the cycle was over. Okay? Now, if you look at the weekly RSI for Bitcoin this cycle, you'll see a very similar trend line where the weekly RSI tries to keep holding at around 44. Okay, it had sort of a drop below it right there, but it was just a fake out. And right now we're right at 44. And this is one of the reasons why I say you really need 2 weekly closes below the 50-week moving average in order for it to mean something, because we do sometimes get fake outs. Even back over there, sometimes it went a little bit lower than 54. Sometimes it would go down to 53. But basically, you can see that this cycle is very similar to the 2017 cycle. It's just that the relative strength index is finding support at 44, whereas back then it found support at around 54. So this cycle, 43 to 44, 2016, 2017, 53 to 54. And when the weekly RSI finally broke, it went all the way down to 47 back then. Now, when that happened, it actually set up a nice counter trend rally back up, but the cycle was in fact over. Now, right now, Bitcoin is sitting at this level. Now, we've done a video on this multiple times, actually. Whenever the weekly RSI gets down here, I try to make a video about it because I just remember what happened in 2017. And I remember, watching this thing break, really wishing it didn't mean the cycle was over, but it did. And so we did the same video, I think about 7 months ago. Yeah, 7 months ago. You can see the price of Bitcoin was around 80K, and the weekly RSI was the same as it is today, right? So the weekly RSI, 44 or so. Bitcoin is $21,000 higher. So if you were able to hold through that correction back then and hold on through today, you actually made some money, right? Like you made sure to not sell in that capitulation low, and ultimately the weekly RSI bounced back up. But when you look at the bounce that it had, it ended up being a lower high, right? It was a lower high. And so what you're getting a support level at around 44, but you're also getting these lower highs in the strength of each rally. So what this tells me is that there is starting to be underlying weakness, even if you get another rally, right? So you could have either a breakdown in the coming weeks that kind of sets up the 2026 bear market, or if you have another rally back up, it still could just put in a lower high, and maybe it would lead to another higher high for the Bitcoin price. But what I'm showing you here is that the strength of these moves has diminished. So whether you get another rally or not before the end of the year, it likely will eventually pan out into a drawdown in the midterm year, right? A drawdown in the midterm year. And that's kind of what sets up that 2026 bear market, just like we've had bear markets in all the prior midterm years. Okay, so I don't think this time is going to be any different. And I know a lot of people want it to be different. I just don't think it's going to be. So from the weekly RSI perspective, you can see that the strength is decaying. Every rally is a little bit less impressive. And if you look, you can see that originally Bitcoin's corrections were not even coming close to testing the prior yearly high, right? And then if you look at this year, Bitcoin got close to testing it back in April, and we said as long as we stay above 74K, we should go to all-time highs. The problem right now is that we've actually dropped below, the high set from early 2025 and late 2024. We're actually below it right now. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't get some type of a bounce at this, potential support level. We are witnessing a death cross in the coming days, right? If you look at the 50-day and 200-day SMA, they are getting closer to crossing. And so that'll be Bitcoin's best chance to try to muster up a rally if it's going to. But to be honest, with, just having a plan and not marrying a certain narrative and not following a certain price prediction just because we want it to do something, you have to look at what the market is telling you. And right now, I see the weekly RSI is at support again. And as a student of the markets, I have to see what is the reaction here. We were here back in April, and we got a bounce, and Bitcoin went to a new all-time high. We're here again. So this is going to tell you relatively soon all the information you need to know for the cycle. Okay, when this breaks down, if it goes into the 30s, the high 30s on weekly closes, the cycle is likely over. Okay? In fact, this support level for the weekly RSI is not that different from, where it eventually broke down in 2022, right? And found support around the similar levels. And back then, again, it took until the midterm year to break down. So if it were to take into the midterm year to break down, there's still a chance it could get a bounce off of it before that ultimately plays out. Now, one of the difficult things about this cycle is that the euphoria phase never really happened. And a lot of the indicators that you would have expected to go off never really went off. And if you look at the 2-week RSI, you could say that it did go off. Because if you look at the 2-week RSI, you can see that, what more do you want, right? But the hard part is that the 2-week RSI topped again back in March of 2024, and it never actually went back up to that high. There was one time in a prior cycle in 2013 where we had sort of an early tag of the trend line, and then it did eventually go back up later on, but it was relatively short-lived. So the 2-week RSI looks complete. But the thing that doesn't look complete and kind of shows you why people feel like this cycle hasn't really been what they imagined. Look at the monthly RSI. The monthly RSI has not given you that euphoria phase, right? That crazy moment where it just feels like it's never going to go down. What's happened is it's instead kind of stalled out a lot lower. Now, the monthly RSI is also coming into a support level, and that support level is around 60, which is where it is right now. So we're at a lot of really critical levels in the weekly RSI, the 2-week RSI, the monthly RSI. No matter how you look at it, we're at a fairly important level. If you look at the daily RSI, right, it's just continued to slowly trend down here. Basically this correction that's been going on for a while, you can see the RSI started trending down back in May, even though the daily did. So the trend, hasn't really seen a massive surge since then. And you can see the daily RSI has been putting in these lower highs and lower lows as well. Right now, note that we are getting pretty low. And normally, Bitcoin forms a local low around the day of the death cross. If a low forms on the day of the death cross and we get a little rally and then it just dumps and we go below the 50-week moving average, that would be the sign that the cycle's over, right? That would be the sign that you would look for. And it's not about what you want to happen. It's just about respecting what does happen. Believe me, guys, I would love nothing more than for Bitcoin to rally off the 50-week moving average, right? Nothing more. I mean, it would be great to have some more positive sentiment back in the space and have a little bit more, enthusiasm in how this might play out and sort of rekindling the animal spirits that exist in all of us. That'd be great, right? If we could do that, and if Bitcoin could get another push to a slightly higher high, and we'll see. I'll be the first to say if it looks like we're closing above these levels and we're kicking the can down the road. We've done it a number of times already, but if we go below it on a couple weekly closes, it just kind of sets up the bear market year, right? So that's where I am right now. Now, if you don't have a euphoria phase, right? If it truly is over, then the bear market might not be as bad. It might be more like that 2019 bear market and just exclude the pandemic, where you just kind of get like a 50% drawdown, not a 70 to 80% drawdown. That would actually get Bitcoin back down to that 200-week moving average, which is normally where Bitcoin goes in the midterm years. In fact, last cycle, we went below the 200-week moving average. So I would argue that Bitcoin will find itself back at the 200-week moving average in 2026. Okay? And I would say that's going to happen regardless of whether the highs are in. So if Bitcoin's high is in, we're already en route to it. But even in the case where Bitcoin goes slightly higher and maybe, gets another push back up to the sort of the top of this trend line and then falls off, you're still likely going to the 200-week SMA sometime by mid to late 2026. It's just a matter of how do you get there? Do you get one more spike up? Do you not? The thing that I told you guys to look for was the devaluation of all Bitcoin pairs. And, some people have come out again, surprise, surprise, calling for alt season on a single sneeze by Bitcoin dominance to the downside. But it just goes to show you, just how much delusion has existed in the space for so many years that, like, any single day where the altcoin market rallies at all against Bitcoin, it leads to a lot of influencers, once again, sort of telling you why you're missing out on a great opportunity if you're invested in Bitcoin and not altcoins. And they'll talk about how altcoins represent like the biggest opportunity you could ever imagine, but they're completely delusional, because what they're really doing, and I don't think they would agree with this statement, but what they're really doing in a lot of cases is they're basically just like the penny stock shillers of the cryptoverse, right? So in stocks, there's what's known as penny stocks, and there's just these like really low market cap, illiquid stocks that a lot of people like know are scams and aren't going anywhere, but yet people still try to present them as like these great opportunities and why you should go buy those instead of like the Magnificent Seven and whatnot. And most people just end up losing all their money betting on penny stocks. Now, that doesn't mean every once in a while one isn't going to go crazy, but that's how people lose their money. They look at the penny stock market and they see like the one thing doing really, really well, and they want to make sure they get the next one. And so they end up throwing all their money into all these penny stocks. They go to zero, but the S&P 500 keeps going up. The Mag 7 keeps going up. In crypto, the same thing has been happening for the last 4.5 years or so, right? There's a lot of these influencers that keep on telling you how great altcoins are, but again, they're just the equivalent of penny stocks. They're even worse than penny stocks in a lot of ways. But they are so convinced that they are right, because that's what happened last cycle, right? They're so convinced that they're right that they're never willing to acknowledge that they get so bullish on every single lower high in the altcoin market under the promise that this time will be different. Now, I'm not saying that you won't eventually have a period like that again, but just think about how demoralizing it has to be if you truly have thought every single rally was the start of alt season, and then it just ended up being a lower high. So I want people to kind of just remember that for future cycles. Like, remember that, you know, labeling it alt season doesn't change the fact that, you know, you're taking a very risky investment and hoping that you outperform something like Bitcoin. If Bitcoin's bull market is over and that's it, there is no alt season. Okay? Right? Like, there just isn't. The only way you can have a durable rally by alt Bitcoin pairs that go back up to the range highs is if you first get a parabolic Bitcoin rally that takes something like the monthly RSI back up to those highs that we saw in prior cycles. If the monthly RSI of Bitcoin were to go to 90, then you could start talking about an alt season. But the reality is that the guys that keep peddling alt season without Bitcoin going to new all-time highs first are just peddling complete garbage, right? Because if Bitcoin does not go to new highs, and if it just breaks down, you will not have an alt season, in my opinion. But if Bitcoin does go to new all-time highs, the process of Bitcoin going to new all-time highs would lead to Bitcoin dominance going a lot higher. So these narratives that people talk about and whatnot on Twitter and on YouTube, they just don't make a lot of sense when you think about them, right? In terms of like the alt season calls, they just don't make a ton of sense if you really start to think about like what they're saying. They're basically saying, hey, these things are gonna, you know, you're gonna have an alt season, but they're kind of ignoring what's happening with Bitcoin. And if we are going to be optimistic about what's happening with Bitcoin and say, all right, it's going to find support at 100K and it's going to go up a lot, you're still better off with Bitcoin than taking all these risky investments in the altcoin market, right? So again, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense in a lot of ways. Now, I know this video was on the weekly RSI and the monthly RSI, but I've just been seeing that a lot recently, and you know, it honestly baffles me that the cycle can go on this long, and we can see sort of the devaluation of all Bitcoin pairs over and over and over again, but it will not stop people from being optimistic on their sort of their declaration for an alt season. So just keep in mind, as I've said before, in order for that stuff to happen, Bitcoin has to go parabolic, which means Bitcoin would have to hold support here at the 50-week moving average, hold support at a weekly RSI of 44, whatever it was. And if it does that, you're still going to be better off in Bitcoin than in altcoins at that point. So I think it's just something to think about. And we'll wrap it up there. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.